Hey, 42 here. On an unreasonably humid morning in 1854, the chief engineer of the Panama Railroad was woken by a man outside his hut screaming at the top of his lungs. What he saw when he opened the door, he later wrote, was something he would never forget if he lived to be 1,000 years old. And let me tell you, it was genuinely one of the most shocking sights I've ever spoken about on this channel, as you'll soon see. But first, how did we even get here in the first place? The Panama Railroad stretches just 47 miles from the Atlantic to the Pacific. By railroad standards, that's nothing. But these aren't your average 47 miles of track, because they go through one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. And no, it's not Luton. This little stretch of railway unlocked the world and supercharged global trade. But it came at the cost of 12,000 lives. That's 255 deaths for every mile of track laid. But to the money moguls and market movers, it didn't matter one bit. The Panama Railroad became one of the most profitable enterprises in American history. For a while, it was the highest priced stock on the New York Stock Exchange, and investors on Wall Street became filthy rich, whilst Chinese, Irish, and Caribbean workers died in their thousands in disease-ridden jungle swamps. Panama is a peculiar place. A narrow tropical isthmus of rainforest and mangrove-fringed coasts that acts as the connective tissue between two great land masses. Spanish conquistadors identified Panama as a crucial economic pinch point way back in the 1500s. They knew that whoever could find a way to move people and goods quickly across this tiny gap would control global trade and two previously unconnected worlds. Yet, for another 300 years, nobody had managed to pull it off. In the early 1800s, getting from the east coast of America to California was an absolute nightmare. You had two options, and both were totally rubbish. You could sail all the way around South America via Cape Horn, a journey of roughly 14,000 miles that would take about 4 to 6 months back then, assuming your ship wasn't consumed by the notoriously treacherous currents along Drake Passage, which many were. Or you could trudge overland across North America itself, which involved months of grueling wagon trails through deserts, mountains, and badlands beset with bandits. Along the way, you could enjoy amenities such as dysentery, starvation, dehydration, and the occasional arrow to the knee, ending your days as an adventurer. But there was a third option, a nifty shortcut. You could simply sail down to Panama, then hack, trudge, and trek your way across 50 miles of dense jungle. After which you'd catch another ship on the Pacific side, heading north up to California. It sounds pretty easy, and a lot more attractive than the first two options, except for the fact that this 50-mile jaunt across land meant canoeing up the Chagres River, which was infested with alligators and prone to flash floods. Then you would need to switch to a mule and trudge across crumbling Spanish trails that hadn't been maintained in half a century, all of which would take about 8 days in total, assuming you survived the onslaught of malaria, yellow fever, cholera, the blistering heat, and murderous bandits. Few people ever chose this third option, for obvious reasons. That was until January 1848, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, and within a few months, everything had changed. Suddenly, tens of thousands of Americans induced with gold fever were desperate to get over to the West Coast by any means possible. They were known as the California 49ers. A surprising number of them chose the Panama route as it was much quicker than the first two options. It was incredibly dangerous, and plenty of people died, But for them, it was worth the risk to get their hands on the juiciest gold claims. They were essentially the Bitcoin bros of the day. Almost overnight, the Panama route became clogged with traffic as thousands crammed onto ships bound for the isthmus. Local boatmen and mule drivers made small fortunes charging extortionate prices to help people cross Panama. Entire tent cities sprang up on both coasts of Panama, full of impatient, transient 49ers. Now, there's that old adage that the people who made the most in the gold rush were those selling the shovels. And just like those shovel sellers, 3 men in New York saw the Panamania that was ensuing down south, and they instantly knew there was an opportunity extracting wealth from people's desire to get to California as quickly as possible. So they decided to build a railroad across Panama, the first transcontinental railroad in the Americas, assuming that once it was complete, it would print money. Boy, were they correct. The first of these 3 ambitious men was William Henry Aspinwall, a shipping magnate who already owned the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. He was one of the wealthiest men in New York, and the city on the Atlantic coast of Panama would actually be named after him. But Aspinwall, Panama, was later renamed to Colón by the Hispanic community in honor of Christopher Columbus's digestive tract. The second opportunistic man was Henry Chauncey, a Wall Street banker with deep pockets and very deep connections. But the third man was probably the most interesting of the lot. John Lloyd Stevens wasn't some wealthy magnate like the others. He was a celebrity explorer, a diplomat, and a best-selling author. A decade earlier, he'd ventured deep into the jungles of Central America and rediscovered the lost cities of the ancient Maya. He once bought an entire ruined Mayan city for just $50. He'd written a book on Central America, several in fact. So unlike Aspinwall and Chauncey, he knew the environment and the jungle better than almost any man in America. Now for a quick ad from Blue Dot. Last year, 4 tech companies, Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft, spent over $400 billion building AI infrastructure. For context, the entire Apollo program, adjusted for inflation, cost about $280 billion. So we're funding multiple moon missions every single year. The only difference? Nobody's entirely sure where we're going. The decisions being made right now by a surprisingly small group of people will shape the direction of this technology for decades. Meanwhile, these models are already working in medicine, law, education, and government. 2 years ago, they couldn't do basic maths. Now, they're helping researchers understand diseases at a molecular level. So, if you've been thinking, I should probably understand this better, you're right. And you're not alone. Most people feel like they're missing something with AI. Blue Dot Impact was built for exactly that feeling. Blue Dot Impact is a non-profit that helps curious, capable people get informed about AI and involved in making it go well for humanity. Thousands have taken their courses, and graduates now work at places like Anthropic, Google DeepMind, the UN, and NATO. And you don't need to be an engineer. They need policy people, lawyers, doctors, journalists. Best of all, the courses are completely free, philanthropically funded, so there's no catch. Start with their Future of AI course. It's 2 hours and there's no technical background needed. The link is in the description below. And genuinely, it's one of the more useful things you could do with 2 hours this week. In December 1848, the 3 men secured a contract with the government of New Granada, present-day Colombia, to build a railroad across Panama. By April of the following year, the Panama Railroad Company was officially incorporated in New York, backed by $1 million of startup capital, about $40 million today. Construction began in May 1850, but from day one, the entire project was cursed. The starting point for the Panama Railroad was Manzanillo Island, which doesn't really exist anymore because it's being consumed by the city of Colón. But to call Manzanillo an island in the first place is pretty generous. It was a festering, waterlogged swamp covered in mangroves and poisonous manchineel plants. And at high tide, most of it was completely underwater. As I said, not a great start. But it gets worse. Before a single piece of track could be laid, the workers, who were mostly Irish or Chinese immigrants, had to hack through thick and poisonous vegetation and then drive wooden piles deep into the muck. Finally, they needed to build a causeway connecting the island to the Panamanian mainland. Buildings to accommodate these workers had to be constructed on stilts to keep them above the waterline. But this proved to be so difficult and time-consuming, they simply towed abandoned ships from the California Gold Rush, which people had used to travel from the east coast of America to Panama and then presumably forgotten about, into the Manzanillo Bay and used them as makeshift dormitories. But these old boats were rotting and full of mosquitoes and rats. After the initial groundworks on Manzanillo Island were done, they started to build out the route itself. The first 8 miles passed through what one engineer described as a jungle of gelatinous swamps infested with alligators. Workers had to labour long hours in water up to 4 feet deep. The ground was so soft that countless tons of gravel and rock had to be dumped just to create a solid foundation for the rails. And just when they thought the ground couldn't get any softer, the rain arrived. Panama receives up to 3.5 meters of rainfall every year, most of it during the rainy season between May and December. I say season, but it's 7 months. That's basically most of the bloody year. The workers themselves were drenched to their bones. They worked in wet clothes and slept in wet clothes. Those clothes rotted, as did their food, the wood, and most importantly, their morale. But the real killer was the mosquitoes. In the 1850s, germ theory was still years away, and the idea that tiny insects could transmit deadly illnesses was little more than a Chinese whisper passed around camp. Workers simply slept in the open whilst mosquitoes covered them from head to toe in bites. The surrounding swamps churned out billions of mosquitoes, and before long, cholera and yellow fever swept through the camps. Then there was the malaria, which caused fever, chills, and delirium. All 3 of these had the unfortunate side effect of death. Men who seemed healthy at breakfast could have been dead by dinner time. The railroad company brought in doctors, but there was almost nothing they could do. They didn't even fully understand what they were fighting. It is for this reason, and probably a few others, that the chief engineer, George Totten, who originally surveyed the route before construction began, almost backed out of the project after he had taken one look at the jungle and the swamps. But the company was obviously paying him enough for him to stay. The story was very different, however, for the regular workers. The company recruited them from wherever they could. Americans were lured by the promise of reasonably good wages. Irish immigrants arrived, fleeing the aftermath of the Great Famine. And so too came various workers from the Caribbean, Colombia, China, and across Europe. During the first year of construction, the railroad was still forging its way across low-lying swampland and hadn't yet reached higher ground. And this presented a significant problem. You see, there were so many people dying, and there was nowhere they could build a proper cemetery for all the deceased. And you can't really bury people in swamps, unless you happen to be a serial killer. And with multiple people dying every day, corpses began piling up. It was becoming a huge logistical problem that slowed the whole project down. But the ever-savvy Panama Railroad Company, who weren't going to let a few inconvenient corpses stand in the way of progress, came up with a solution that was kind of ingenious and would actually turn a profit to boot. You see, it came to the attention of the higher-ups that most of the workers who died were anonymous. They were known only by their first name and had no address or next of kin. It also happened that in the 1850s, medical schools around the world were absolutely desperate for cadavers to train their students. The demand for fresh bodies far exceeded supply, which led to a 19th century side hustle of so-called resurrection men, who made a small fortune digging up graves to sell the corpses to medical schools. So, the Panama Railroad Company thought, why not turn what is a side hustle for others into a full-on revenue stream? After all, they had ready access to plenty of raw goods, cadavers, and a constant supply that didn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. So, sure enough, the company began pickling the unclaimed bodies of dead workers in large wooden barrels and shipping them off to medical schools and hospitals all around the world. For years, the Panama Railroad Company became one of the world's biggest suppliers of human cadavers. And it wasn't just a small footnote in the company's ledger, it was one of the largest revenue streams in the business. The proceeds from selling corpses were enough to pay for the company's hospital. But it gets even weirder. The man behind the wholesale corpse operation was Dr. J.A. Totten, the company's chief physician and the brother of chief engineer George Totten. So, whilst one brother was overseeing the construction that killed the workers, the other was busy profiting from their deaths. Yeah, I'd love to know what their childhood was like. Despite the relentless death bell tolling along the steel of the tracks every morning as the corpses piled higher and higher, the company had investors to please, deadlines to meet, and a fortune awaiting them at the other side. So rather than doing the moral things, such as improving health and safety standards or calling off the project altogether, they only amped up their recruitment efforts. They focused on places that hadn't yet heard how deadly Panama truly was, in particular the Irish fleeing the Great Famine. However, that avenue of workers and bodies dried up after an Irish-American newspaper published an article in 1853 entitled "Irish Graves in Panama," warning readers of the fearful sacrifice of life that awaited them. Cork newspapers also printed testimonies from workers who'd returned home from the railroad, detailing their horrors. So the company shifted its focus towards China. In March 1854, the clipper ship Sea Witch arrived in Panama Harbor. It was famous for setting speed records on the high seas, but on board the Sea Witch that day were over 700 Chinese labourers, most of them from southern China. They'd been promised decent wages in a far-off tropical land, and crucially, their contracts also guaranteed a daily ration of opium. Which seems odd, but it was not unusual for Chinese labourers of the era to imbibe as a part of their daily lives. But upon their arrival in this tropical land, the realization hit them that they'd been sent to their death sentences. The Chinese workers were used for the worst sections of the route. They were made to hack through dense jungle, drain swamps, and haul ungodly amounts of earth in the most horrific conditions. Unlike the Irish workers, many of the Chinese labourers had never encountered tropical diseases and had zero immunity. Malaria and yellow fever cut through them like a scythe through wet grass. Within weeks of their arrival, the Chinese were dying so quickly that even the railroad company's management were beginning to worry. And that says a lot, because until now, they had given the grand total of 0 shits over the workers' deaths. And if you thought things couldn't get any worse, or the management any crueler, well, you obviously haven't been following this story very well. Because when the directors back in New York learnt just how much those daily opium rations were costing them, they abruptly cut off the supply in direct violation of the workers' contracts. It turns out opium withdrawal is a force to be reckoned with, and these men, who were already sick, exhausted, and thousands of miles from home, were now suffering with yet another horrendous ailment. And in the end, it just proved too much for them to take. One morning, as chief engineer George Totten lay on a cot in his hut near the town of Matoshine, Recovering from yet another bout of malaria, he was roused by someone screaming in horror outside. He staggered out of bed and unbolted the door to find James Baldwin, his assistant chief engineer, translucent with fear and drenched in sweat. Baldwin implored Totten to come immediately because the Chinese workers had begun strapping themselves to trees and doing something YouTube won't allow me to talk about. Totten would later write that if he should live to be as old as Methuselah, he would never forget what he saw that morning. When he and Baldwin arrived at the site, there were more than 100 Chinese workers dangling from trees. Most had used their own hair to loop their long braids around their necks and tied the ends to tree limbs. Others had thrown themselves onto their own machetes, and a few had tied stones to their clothing and simply jumped into the river. Totten also reported some of the Chinese workers had paid Malay labourers to shoot them and cut off their heads. From the surrounding brush, witnesses described hearing high-pitched laughter, followed by the blasts of blunderbusses. I genuinely don't know what to say about all of that, so we'll just move on. So, what did the company do in response to this mass deciding not to wake up again event? Obviously, their minds didn't turn to guilt or, God forbid, reforms to improve the situation for the remaining workers. The company simply saw it as a logistics problem. Management's primary concern was replacing the dead Chinese workers and ensuring the survivors didn't go down the same path. So the surviving Chinese labourers were gradually phased out. But this phasing out was almost as cruel as the horrors that had preceded it. 197 of the surviving Chinese workers were literally traded like livestock for black Jamaican workers. The going rate was $17.77 per Chinese man, paid to secure his relocation to the sugar plantations of Jamaica. They had simply moved from one hell to another. Oh, and remember the town of Matashine, where the mass No More Lifing event took place? Well, a popular tale soon spread amongst the workers that the name was a deliberate contraction of Mata, Spanish for kill, and Chino, Chinese. But it's highly doubtful those in charge would actually have named a town Kill Chinese, so it's widely accepted to have been a Chinese whisper rather than fact. But the railroad wasn't done with its workers yet, not even close. By mid-1852, they had slogged through about 23 miles of swamp and burnt through roughly $1 million of the company's original capital. And now they had arrived at the most seemingly insurmountable object of the entire route, the Chagres River. Now, crossing a river might not sound like a big deal. Railways cross rivers all the time. But this wasn't some cutesy bridge over the River Thames. The Chagres was an absolute beast of a waterway that could rise 40 feet in a single day during heavy rain. So in the morning it could be all sunshine and rainbows, but by the late afternoon the river had swallowed your footings that you just laid, washed away your tools, and drowned several of your co-workers. The engineers initially built a wooden bridge at a place called Barbacoas, but in very little time the river rose dramatically and washed the entire bridge away in one fell swoop. The result of months of work, backbreaking labour, and quite a few more dead workers was gone in a flash. So in its place they built a 300-foot-long iron bridge that was tall enough to survive the tantrums of the Chagres. It cost over a year to build, a small fortune of the company's cash, and a few more deaths, of course. And that was just one of the 300 bridges and culverts the workers were required to build along the route. Bearing in mind, this railway was only 47 miles long, which meant there were a frankly absurd 6 bridges or culverts for every mile of track. The construction of the track itself was also causing the company and the workers a headache. Specifically, the railroad sleepers, sometimes called ties. They were originally made of pine, but humidity in Panama sits at about 90%, so the freshly placed pine sleepers rotted in under a year. The solution was to use lignum vitae instead, one of the densest, hardest and heaviest timbers in the world, found in trees native to the Caribbean and South America. It did the trick, but necessitated the arduous new step of having to drill all the way through the sleepers before the workers could drive spikes into them. Which doesn't sound like much, until you learn that they were doing all of this using hand drills. But if the swamps, the river, and the rotting infrastructure weren't enough, the railroad still had one final boss to face: the Continental Divide itself. At a place called Culebra, the railroad had to cross the Continental Divide, and the only way to cross it with a railroad was to cut through it. Its summit was only 287 feet above sea level, which is a mere speed bump as far as mountains go, but it was an obstacle nonetheless. Workers dug a trench over 40 feet deep and roughly 2,500 feet long, carving through solid earth and rock at the highest point of the isthmus. They used explosives to break the rock, then loaded the debris by hand onto rail cars. It was back-breaking work, but their efforts later served as the template for the significantly larger Culebra cut that would be needed for the Panama Canal 50 years later. Subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that one. It wasn't just the workers that the railroad was claiming. Do you remember John Lloyd Stevens, the celebrity explorer and Panama Railroad Company co-founder? Well, in the spring of 1852, whilst visiting the construction site, Stevens was struck down by malaria. He died that October, aged only 46. Just about 1 year for every mile of the railroad he'd helped conceive. He never saw it completed. Of the three co-founders, Stevens was actually the only one who regularly visited Panama. Aspinwall and Chauncey were quite content to manage things from the comfort of their New York offices, far away from the malaria and the daily horrors of the project itself. By late 1854, progress had been slow and the death count numerous. So the company adopted a two-pronged attack from here on out. They split into two teams. One from the Atlantic side pushed westward. They had it worse as there were more swamps, jungles, mosquitoes, and general shittery on that side. The second team, the Pacific side, pushed eastward from Panama City. They were able to make quicker progress due to the slightly less murderous terrain. And then, on a wet evening on January 27, 1855, the two teams met at the summit. George Totten, the long-suffering chief engineer, who by this point had survived multiple bouts of malaria, drove the final spike into a crosstie by the light of sputtering whale oil lamps in the pouring rain. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were now connected by rail. The following day, a locomotive with freight and passenger cars made the first complete journey across Panama from ocean to ocean. It may have only been a journey of 47 miles, but to get to this point had taken 4.5 years, an estimated 12,000 deaths, and a final price tag of about $8 million, about $280 million today. 8 times the original budget of $1 million. But the directors of the Panama Railroad Company didn't care one iota, because almost overnight it started printing money, exactly as the three founders had predicted. A one-way ticket was $25 worth of gold, roughly $930 today. And do you know what? People paid it. Of course they did, because the alternative was a 6-month voyage around Cape Horn with a strong likelihood of death, or a relentless and exhausting expedition across the American interior with a strong likelihood of death. Or of course they could attempt to chop and trudge their way through the Panama jungle on foot, as many had done before, with a strong likelihood of death. Within a decade, the Panama Railroad was generating $11 million a year in revenue and briefly became the highest priced stock on the New York Stock Exchange. A single share changed hands for a whopping $295. To put that into perspective, a typical railroad stock on the NYSE at the time traded for somewhere between $50 and $100 a share. But the problem with the Panama Railroad is that it was only so valuable because it held a monopoly on quickly traversing the continent, and it didn't take long before that monopoly was smashed. On the 10th of May 1869, just 14 years after the first train had trundled across the bloody tracks of the isthmus, a golden spike was driven into the ground at Promontory Summit, Utah, completing the first transcontinental railroad across the United States. All of a sudden, you could travel from New York to California without having to take a boat down to Panama, a vastly overpriced train ride, and then pay for yet another boat ride up the western coast. For the vast majority of travelers, the Panama Railroad became obsolete overnight, and the company's share price collapsed from $295 to $60. The railroad lived on, barely. The French briefly revived its fortunes in the 1880s when they attempted to build a canal across Panama. And suddenly the railroad was vital for hauling equipment and men through the jungle. But in 1904, the French surrendered and the Americans took over the canal project. Once again, the railroad found a second life as the logistical backbone of their construction efforts. Every day it hauled enormous quantities of excavated earth out of the Culebra Cut. By the way, if you think the 12,000 deaths building the Panama Railroad was bad, the French effort to construct a canal cost in the region of 22,000 deaths and $287 million. And it was all for nothing, really. As I'd previously mentioned, but feel strangely obliged as an Englishman to say once more, in the end, they surrendered. Anyway, that's a story for a future video. When the Americans finally finished the Panama Canal in 1914 without surrendering, it was essentially the death knell for the railroad. Ships no longer needed to stop at all. There was no unloading in the harbour, no rail crossing, and no reloading on the other side. They simply sailed straight through. By the time Panama took control of the railroad in 1979 as part of the Canal Treaties, it was already a shadow of its glory days. By the 1990s, trains were crawling along at 10 miles per hour on crumbling infrastructure, losing millions of dollars a month. The jungle was slowly reclaiming the route that 12,000 people had died to painstakingly carve out. It was eventually privatized and modernized in the early 2000s, and today it still runs, carrying shipping containers mostly. You won't find any gold-fevered prospectors aboard its carriages today. They do a weekly tourist run between Panama City and Colón with a glass-domed observation car and views of the canal, catering mostly to cruise ship passengers. A one-way ticket will set you back $25, which, funnily enough, is the exact same price in gold that the 49ers once paid to cross the isthmus 2 centuries ago. If there's one lesson we can take away from the Panama Railroad and the canal that followed, it's that lives really matter. Just not as much as gold, apparently. Thanks for watching.